Judge tries to remove black woman from court. Then the attorney general walks in. Below is a continuous narrative with approximately 5,000 words, though the exact count may vary slightly. It follows your requested structure, maintains a realistic tone, and aims to deliver a powerful message about perseverance, justice, and the fight against prejudice, without breaking it into clear chapters. It builds up tension, includes an unexpected twist, and ends on a strong, triumphant note. I hope you find it engaging and emotionally resonant. The ceiling fans rattled quietly, stirring the thick summer heat inside the old courthouse. A sense of heavy anticipation hung in the air, difficult to articulate yet impossible to ignore. It was in the subtle hush that fell whenever footsteps echoed against the polished floors, and in the watchful gazes of clerks who peered over the rims of their glasses, pens poised, half expecting something extraordinary to happen. Even in the waiting area, where people usually fidgeted with phones or rummaged through purses, a steady unease lingered, as if everyone could sense that the building was charged with an undercurrent of tension. Slight squeaks of uncomfortable chairs, the muffled shuffling of legal papers, and the occasional clearing of throats provided the overture to a drama that was about to unfold. At the center of this gathering storm was a young black woman named. She was only 29, but carried herself with a composed dignity that suggested wisdom beyond her years. Years spent balancing precarious responsibilities had graced her with a quiet confidence, though she was no stranger to adversity. Her hair was neatly pinned up, revealing a graceful neckline. The subdued cut of her dress suggested both care and practicality. She shifted slightly on the bench, smoothing out a fold in her skirt as she tried to review her notes for the final time. She had come to the courthouse that day for what was supposed to be a simple civil hearing. Nothing about it was supposed to attract headlines. Nothing about it was supposed to change her life. Yet in the pit of her stomach, a strange, foreboding feeling took root. His gaze drifted across the hallway where she could glimpse a small cluster of attorneys exchanging hushed words. She recognized one of them, an older man with a severe expression and thinning hair. His name was David. He had been opposing counsel on a previous case in which she had as a character witness for a who was unfairly sued by an insurance company. Was not a lawyer herself, her field was social work, but she believed wholeheartedly in justice. On that previous occasion, her honest testimony had irked enough that he had tried and failed to discredit her character. She had suspected that he took a personal dislike to her, though she never understood why. He was a fixture in the local legal circuit, rumored to have friends in high places, and he represented a mindset that had encountered too often. Polished professionalism masking a subtle but potent prejudice. That morning was there for a different reason. A small community center, one that she volunteered at and helped manage, had been threatened with closure by local authorities due to zoning disputes and complaints from a neighboring property owner. Had stepped up to speak for the center. Her presence was to ensure that the judge understood exactly how crucial this resource was for families in the area. Children came there after school, single parents relied on it for weekend food distribution, and seniors found a place to socialize and receive wellness checks. Had meticulously prepared a statement, collected testimonials, and compiled data. She believed that if the court simply heard the facts, reason and compassion would prevail. Perhaps that was an optimist at heart, even if life had given her little cause for unbridled hope. A bailiff appeared at the doorway, scanning the waiting area, then called name. She stood up, gathered her documents, and swallowed the persistent lump in her throat. Heart pounding, she followed him into the courtroom. The space was smaller than the grand rooms portrayed on television, but it still felt imposing, with tall windows framed by heavy drapes, rows of carved wooden pews, and the judge's bench raised at the front. The judge himself, the Honorable Mercer, was an older man with a meticulously groomed white beard. He exuded an air of authority that, at first glance, seemed perfectly reasonable for a man of his position. Yet there was something about his pinched expression and the near sneer he wore that made uneasy. She took her seat at the table reserved for the community center's side. Next to her sat an attorney who volunteered part-time at a legal aid organization. Offered a reassuring nod and a firm handshake. Across the aisle, David was already seated with a stack of files. He glanced at, and his thin lips curved into a faint smile that did nothing to conceal his disdain. Inhaled deeply, reminding herself that this was about the community center and the people who depended on it. She was here to do the right thing, not to engage in personal battles. Judge Mercer cleared his throat and asked both parties to state their names and affiliations for the record. His voice trembled slightly when it was her turn, but she delivered her introduction politely. Took over explaining the role of the community center and the importance of the hearing. On the surface, everything seemed routine. The clerk, seated at a small desk to the side, typed diligently into a computer. The judge's gaze slid between the two parties, only occasionally lingering on. Began his arguments first, claiming that the center had not properly followed protocol when it expanded its services. He alleged zoning violations and even suggested that the center's activities were attracting a less desirable crowd, thus negatively affecting nearby property values. At the mention of less desirable, felt her spine stiffen. She exchanged a look with who made a note on her legal pad. The hush in the courtroom thickened. Judge Mercer gave no immediate reaction to statement. He simply nodded and motioned for it to continue, as though prejudice-laced comments were standard fare. Rose next, speaking with a calm, measured tone honed by years of defending marginalized clients. She explained that the center was legally compliant, that it held the correct permits, and that expansions were done within legal guidelines. There was a slight oversight with a minor building code, but the center had swiftly corrected it. As the judge flipped through the documents provided, tried to read his expression. He remained impassive, his brow furrowing as if deciding how best to respond. It was only when was called to testify that the atmosphere subtly shifted. The judge's eyes narrowed, approached the witness stand and took the oath, promising to tell the truth. She settled into the creaking wooden chair, her hand clutching her notes a bit too tightly. Began by asking to describe her involvement with the community center, how she had grown up in a similar program, how she recognized the immeasurable value of safe gathering places for at-risk youth, and how she spent countless hours organizing drives for food, clothing, and even after-school tutoring sessions. His words flowed with genuine passion. She recounted heartwarming success stories, teenagers who had improved their grades, adults who found job assistance. Each anecdote painted a vivid picture of a lifeline that would be severed if the center closed. Then came cross-examination. His questions, though carefully worded, carried a sneering undertone. He demanded specifics on the number of participants, the center's funding, and the background of the volunteers, implying ever so delicately that many came from neighborhoods with higher crime rates. Answered firmly, unwavering in her belief that no one was lesser for having less. She knew wanted to get a rise out of her. Yet in the corner of her vision, she spotted the judge scribbling notes. He didn't interrupt line of questioning, didn't bat an eyelid at the insinuations. Tension twisted in stomach. After what felt like an eternity, offered a few follow-up questions to let reaffirm her points. Concluded by emphasizing that the center was more than just a building, it was a beacon of hope. As she stepped down from the stand, she glanced at Judge Mercer. He pursed his lips as if he'd tasted something sour, then asked both sides to make final statements. The entire hearing had taken only a couple of hours, but felt as though she'd battled for days. When the judge said he would review the evidence and reconvene shortly, smirk gave a bad feeling. She retreated to a small bench near the back of the courtroom, waiting. His mind churned with anticipation. What if the judge ruled against them outright? This was the center's last chance. The tension was so heavy that thought she could feel her pulse in her throat. One by one, other cases were called, while they awaited their turn to hear the verdict. Hours slipped by in a haze of procedural drudgery. She tried to distract herself by flipping through her notes, but she couldn't keep focus. Offered reassuring words. Judges sometimes take their time with these decisions. We've done everything by the book. Finally, near late afternoon, the bailiff once again called and to the front. Judge Mercer reappeared on the bench, looking noticeably weary, but there was a certain glint in his eye that discomfited. She braced herself. The judge cleared his throat, his tone surprisingly terse. He quickly summarized the case, referencing the alleged zoning issues, the arguments from both sides, and the documentation offered. But he zeroed in on minor lapses, like the time the center hosted an outdoor event without a particular permit. His heart sank with each point he made. It felt as though the good that the center did was being overshadowed by small bureaucratic oversights. When he finally delivered his ruling, her world crashed. He found in favor of his petition to shut down the center, citing a pattern of negligence and potential hazards to community safety. It was an official condemnation. head swam, ears roaring with the sound of her own disbelieving heartbeat. Immediately stood, requesting the chance to appeal. The judge, looking down his nose, responded sharply. That may be your prerogative, counselor, but I urge you to think carefully about the resources such an appeal would waste. Felt her throat tighten. Before she could stop herself, she spoke up, raw emotion tinting her voice. Your Honor, please, you have to understand, this center is crucial for our neighborhood. She stepped forward, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Shutting it down is going to hurt people who can't fight back. This isn't justice. A hush fell on the room, even the clerk's typing slowed. Judge Mercer glared as though she had committed a grave sin by daring to address him directly. She was only trying to make a final plea for compassion. Instead, the judge's expression contorted with indignation. Miss, he spat, you are out of line. He nodded toward the bailiff. Remove her from this courtroom if she can't control herself. She froze, her pulse hammering. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. The bailiff stepping forward, raising her hands in protest, and David's smug grin. Shocked gasps rippled through those seated. Tried to gather herself to maintain her composure, but the sense of outrage was overwhelming. She had never been ejected from any official place in her life, certainly not a courtroom, for respectfully voicing the truth. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as the bailiff inched closer, clearly uncomfortable with the order but bound to follow it. I'm not causing a disruption, managed to utter, her voice trembling. I'm just speaking for those who can't. The judge's face reddened. He banged his gavel sharply. Bailiff, he barked, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. Braced for the bailiff's grip, desperately tried to speak. Your Honor, she's not being disruptive, she simply. Enough, Judge Mercer's tone was venomous now, eyes flashing. He pointed a rigid finger as if she were the root of all misconduct in his court. I want her out, now. A wave of indignation rose in his chest. The sting of injustice had never felt more visceral. She wanted to speak again, but a tangle of emotions stopped her. It wasn't just the blow of the center's closure or the personal attack. It was the raw sense that this might be about something deeper, more insidious than a simple procedural matter. She had felt from the moment she stepped in that the judge's eyes carried a judgment of their own, formed long before the hearing. As the bailiff gently placed a hand on her elbow, preparing to lead her toward the back door, the thick doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak. The entire room shifted its focus. A tall figure in a dark, impeccably tailored suit strode in, flanked by two aides. The newcomer's presence was commanding, a quiet, self-assured poise that took up the space in a way that demanded immediate attention. Recognized her instantly. The woman who walked in was none other than Hill, the Attorney General of the state. Her reputation preceded her, a fierce advocate for civil rights, a reformer who believed in equitable law, and a woman who had risen through systemic barriers to hold one of the highest offices in state government. She was in her early 50s, with short-cropped hair and a sharp, attentive gaze. Had only ever seen her on television or in news interviews, championing the rights of disenfranchised communities. The courtroom's collective hush deepened to a silent astonishment. People shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to rise in respect or remain still. Judge Mercer froze, hand still clutching his gavel. David's smug expression flickered with unease. Even the bailiff paused mid-step, glancing between the judge and this sudden arrival. In the stunned silence, the Attorney General's voice resonated like a calm but firm chord of music. I heard there might be a matter of great urgency here, she said, scanning the room with cool confidence. I do hope I'm not too late. A swirl of confusion gripped. How had the Attorney General even heard about this case? The closure of a small community center hardly seemed like something that would draw statewide attention. Yet there she was, standing in all her quiet authority, looking as though she had meticulously planned each moment of this entrance. Judge Mercer hastily composed himself. He cleared his throat, struggling to adopt a neutral tone. Madam Attorney General, we weren't expecting a visit from your office. What can we do for you? Hill turned to the bailiff, who still had a gentle hold on his elbow. I'd like her to remain, the Attorney General said. If there's any reason Miss needs to be escorted out, I'd like to hear it. The bailiff loosened his grip immediately, stepping back. Stood rooted in place, her heart pounding as she locked eyes with Hill. There was warmth in that gaze, but also a steely determination. At that moment, realized that something far bigger was unfolding. This was no random visit. The tension in the room soared to new heights as Judge Mercer blinked, searching for words. His lips pursed, betraying his mounting irritation. There was a minor disruption," he said, voice shaky with forced calm. "Miss spoke out of turn, but if you would like her to remain, then so be it." Hill inclined her head in a gesture of thanks, then took a seat in the front row, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. The two aides with her positioned themselves nearby, hands folded. David started, a flicker of apprehension crossing his features. Gently guided back to their seats, confusion and hope swirled inside's mind. She wondered if the Attorney General was investigating the judge for some reason, or if there had been a complaint filed. The possibilities fluttered like 1,000 wings in her chest. Trying to regain the of control, Judge Mercer looked down at a set of papers in front of him. "Where were we?" He mumbled gruffly. Then, in a louder voice, "I've already issued my decision. The center is to be closed, effective." "Your Honor," Hill interjected gently, "I'm here to observe proceedings and also to serve notice that my office has received multiple complaints regarding judicial conduct in this courthouse. In particular, we have reason to believe that certain decisions made under your purview may have been influenced by factors other than the law." A collective intake of breath rippled across the courtroom. The judge's face paled, and he bristled. "I beg your pardon, this is highly irregular." "Perhaps," Hill conceded, her posture calm and composed. "But so is a pattern of rulings that disproportionately disadvantaged communities of color and nonprofit organizations dedicated to those communities. We have been reviewing data, and it appears that nearly 70% of your decisions in cases involving minority-run businesses or community services have been decided against them, often citing minor violations as cause for extraordinary measures." Le's heart pounded. Was this really happening? She looked over at whose eyes glistened with sudden optimism. On the other side, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Mercer set his jaw, glowering at the Attorney General. "My rulings are rooted in the law," he hissed, trying to maintain authority. "If you think you can waltz in here and question my integrity—" "I can," Hill said evenly, her voice unwavering. "In fact, as the chief legal officer of this state, it is not only within my rights but my duty to ensure that the law is administered fairly. I'm also here to investigate allegations of bias. If we find evidence that your rulings are motivated by personal prejudice rather than legal principle, you could face sanctions or removal from the bench." The room felt electrified. Whispered murmurs spread like wildfire among the onlookers. The judge's cracked, revealing a fury he could no longer contain. His voice, which had moments ago tried for calm, now trembled with indignation. "This is an outrage. Bailiff, escort the Attorney General out if she will not follow proper." The bailiff didn't move. He stood, rooted to the spot, torn between the orders of a judge and the presence of the highest legal authority in the state. The judge's request was absurd on its face. One does not simply remove the Attorney General from a courtroom. Hill merely raised an eyebrow. "I assure you," she said quietly, "it would be unwise to obstruct an ongoing investigation." Her tone was calm, but the threat was unmistakable. Felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mix of pent-up frustration and a sudden rush of validation. For so long, it felt like the deck was stacked against people like her, like no matter how hard she fought, the system would find a way to marginalize her. But here was a woman of power, someone who looked a bit like someone who had fought her own battles, walking in and challenging the entire structure of that prejudice. It felt momentous, a turning point. She wanted to cry out in relief or cheer, but she simply clutched hand and watched, mesmerized. Judge Mercer floundered, searching for some semblance of control. "How dare you accuse me?" Hill stood, crossing the short distance to the counsel tables in front of the bench. She placed a small, neatly bound file on the table, sliding it toward the judge. "These are preliminary findings from our investigation. They detail a series of rulings that suggest a concerning pattern. Until this matter is resolved, I strongly recommend you refrain from finalizing any orders, including the one you just issued regarding the closure of the community center." Turning to, she added, "Furthermore, Counselor, any attempt to enforce that order in the interim may constitute a willful disregard for an active inquiry by the Attorney General's office." His eyes flicked from the judge to the Attorney General. He tried to muster a protest, but the words caught in his throat. Could almost feel his frustration, though she had no sympathy for him. After a beat of charged silence, Judge Mercer spoke in a low, almost growling tone. "I will temporarily suspend the order," he managed. His face was taut with anger, his hand gripping the edge of the bench. "But I will not be intimidated. My record speaks for itself." Hill nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it does," she said, meeting his glare without flinching. "And we intend to listen closely to what it says." What happened next felt surreal. The judge abruptly stood, muttered something about a recess, and stormed out of the courtroom, ignoring the standard decorum of dismissing everyone. The bailiff, looking equally stunned, hurried after him. Began gathering his papers, disapproval etched in every line of his face. Meanwhile, Hill turned to and with a gentle smile. "I'd like to speak with you in private," she said, "if that's all right." It felt as though she'd just come up for air after nearly drowning. She found her voice. "Yes, of course," she said, still trying to process the extraordinary scene that had just unfolded. Looked both amazed and relieved. They followed the Attorney General to a small conference room at the end of the hallway, her aides staying just outside. Inside the modest room, Hill invited to sit. The Attorney General's demeanor was calm, but her eyes reflected compassion and a fierce determination. "First, I want to say I'm sorry for what you experienced in that courtroom," she began. "Nobody should be threatened with removal simply for trying to speak, especially when you're standing up for your community." Swallowed hard, emotion surging. "Thank you," she whispered. I'm still in shock. How did you know to come? Did someone file a complaint about this hearing?" Hill folded her hands on the table. "We receive many complaints about judicial bias, but it's rare that they're backed by substantial evidence. Over the last year, a pattern has emerged in cases presided over by Judge Mercer. Our office has been quietly investigating, collecting data, and interviewing individuals. Several local attorneys and community activists pointed us in this direction. We heard about this hearing, specifically, that Mercer might be planning to hastily shut down your center. It fit the pattern a little too well. So I decided to see it for myself." Let out a breath she'd been holding. "I had no idea this was happening. Thank you for stepping in. We were at a loss." Hill nodded. "It's not over yet. The judge's reaction might complicate matters. We'll continue our investigation, and if the evidence holds, we'll take this up with the Judicial Disciplinary Committee. In the meantime, that order to shut down the center is on hold. You should still prepare for another hearing, but ideally with a different judge. Let's just say I'll be paying close attention." A wave of gratitude nearly overwhelmed. She dabbed at her eyes, fighting tears. "Thank you," she said again, her voice trembling. "So many people rely on that center. It's more than just a building, it's hope." "Hope is exactly what we need to preserve," Hill replied gently. "And it's also what we need to restore in the legal system. If the judiciary is compromised by bias, it undermines every tenet of justice we stand for." Cleared her throat. "Is there anything, or the community center staff need to do?" Hill mulled over the question. "Document everything. Keep track of any communication, intimidation, or questionable actions. My office will remain in contact. And don't lose faith. These battles can take time, but they are worth fighting." They spoke for a while longer, ironing out details, exchanging contact information. At one point, mustered the courage to ask a more personal question. "Madam Attorney General, you could have sent someone else, a representative. Why come in person?" A faint smile touched Hill's lips. "I remember being in your position when I was younger," she confessed. "Feeling dismissed by people in power, not being heard. Sometimes it takes the image of someone who looks like you, who has walked a similar path, to remind you that the system can be changed from within. Besides, certain things require a direct approach." Those words stirred something in Soul. It was validation, empowerment, and a realization that she, too, could make a difference. The flickering sense of possibility she'd carried all her life was, for once, not being snuffed out by gatekeepers or prejudice. When they finally emerged from the conference room, the courthouse was partially emptied. The workday was nearly over, and many cases had adjourned. A few curious onlookers lingered by the door, hoping for a glimpse of what was happening. Hill offered, and a reassuring nod, and then departed, her aides trailing her like silent sentinels. Exhaled loudly. "I have to admit," she said, looking at with awe, "I didn't see that coming in a million years." Managed a smile, a real one fueled by a surge of hope. "Neither did I," she replied. "But I'm so relieved. We're not done, but this is more than I could have imagined." They left the courthouse, stepping out onto the warm city street. The sun was setting, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and pink, and for a moment closed her eyes, savoring the rays on her skin. It felt symbolic, as if the daylight was returning to a world that had momentarily gone dark. People bustled past on the sidewalk, oblivious to the drama that had just played out inside those walls. The following days were a whirlwind. Word spread fast through the local community. The judge had tried to remove from the courtroom, but the attorney general appeared, halting the closure. The story took on a life of its own on social media. Found herself at the center of attention she never asked for, with acquaintances calling to congratulate her and strangers stopping her in the grocery store to ask if it was all true. But the most important thing was the center. A renewed sense of purpose enveloped everyone who worked there. Volunteers became more motivated, parents more engaged, and donors more generous. It was as if the close call reignited everyone's determination to keep that essential lifeline intact. Yet it wasn't all triumphant. An undercurrent of anxiety lingered. Judge Mercer's ruling was technically only suspended, not revoked. There would be another hearing, and was still out there, presumably fuming and plotting his next move. Knew that prejudice, once exposed, didn't simply vanish overnight. It could retreat into shadowy corners, waiting for a chance to strike again. So she doubled her efforts, collecting more testimonials and ensuring the center's paperwork was impeccable. Filed an appeal and requested a new judge, citing a potential conflict of interest. They also kept in close contact with the Attorney General's office, providing updates whenever needed. One late afternoon, sat in her modest living room, scanning through folders spread across her coffee table. Each folder contained documents about the center's finances, building codes, or stories from families who had benefited from its programs. She'd come home from work and immediately resumed preparing. As she flipped through page after page, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Usually she'd ignore it, but something nudged her to pick up. Hello. She greeted tentatively. A hesitant, gravelly voice emerged. Is this? She hesitated. Yes, who is this? A pause, then, my name doesn't really matter, but I used to work in the courthouse. I have some information about Judge Mercer that might help you. His heart pounded. What kind of information? He's done this before. There are sealed records, cases that never made it to public light because of deals behind closed doors. If you want them, I can get them to you. Her mind raced with conflicting instincts, caution and curiosity. Why are you telling me this? I saw what happened to you in court, and I'm tired of staying silent. I've watched him ruin good people's lives, and nobody ever fought back. This time you have the Attorney General on your side, which means it might actually matter. But I can't do this openly. I need to remain anonymous. Stomach twisted. It felt like stepping into a world she never wanted to enter, one of conspiracies and cover-ups. But she knew that truth was on the line. How do we do this? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. They agreed on a meeting place, a public park with enough foot traffic to avoid suspicion. The next day, told about the call, was apprehensive but recognized it could be crucial evidence. And so, on a gray, breezy afternoon, found herself standing near a playground, scanning faces. Eventually, a slender figure in a hooded jacket approached. She couldn't make out much of his face, just the tension in his posture. Without looking her in the eye, he slipped a plain manila envelope into her hand. This is a copy, he muttered. The originals are safe, but if you can't use this to prove wrongdoing, nothing will. And then he was gone, melting into the crowd before could thank him or ask more. She hurried back to her car, heart racing, hands trembling. Inside the envelope, she discovered documents detailing a pattern of suspicious rulings, hidden from public record, where Mercer appeared to have colluded with certain attorneys, especially in cases involving minority plaintiffs or defendants. There were notes of private correspondences, anomalies in case assignments, and references to financial incentives. His breath caught in her throat. This was explosive, if real. She dialed his number, voice shaking as she explained. That evening, they brought the envelope to the Attorney General's office. Hill wasn't there in person, but they handed it to an investigator on her team, a no-nonsense woman who carefully examined the contents. The investigator's eyebrows shot up. This is serious, she muttered, scanning the first page. We'll need to verify its authenticity. If it's genuine, we're looking at major implications. The next few weeks were of tension. Attended community fundraisers, balanced her job, and tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. Each day, she half expected some form of retaliation from the judge Yet surprisingly, no direct confrontation came. She suspected that Mercer was lying low, possibly conferring with his allies. Meanwhile, Hill's investigation gained momentum. Rumors swirled that more witnesses were coming forward, emboldened by the knowledge they weren't alone. During this time, found herself plagued by a recurring dream. In it, she was back in the courtroom, wearing the same dress, clutching her notes. The judge's gavel banged, echoing louder and louder. She'd try to speak, but no sound came out of her mouth. Then, from the back of the court, Hill would appear, and the silence would break like a storm. The dream always ended before could see the outcome, leaving her with a knot of unresolved anxiety that lingered even after she woke. Eventually, the day of the new hearing arrived, and a group of supporters from the center headed to the courthouse at dawn. The vibe was vastly different from before. Media crews gathered outside, swirling around like restless hawks. Hill's involvement had turned an otherwise routine civil matter into a focal point for the larger story of judicial misconduct. A small protest line had formed on the sidewalk, with handmade signs urging justice and fairness. Recognized some of the families from the center holding those signs. Their presence both uplifted and frightened her. So many hopes and expectations rested on what might happen inside those walls. The hearing was assigned to a different judge, Judge Franklin, known for her fairness and meticulous approach to the law. She was a middle-aged woman with kind, perceptive eyes. Noticed that Judge Franklin seemed to have read the case file thoroughly. She asked pointed questions about the zoning rules, the center's compliance, and the exact nature of the complaints. Looking visibly unnerved by the media presence, tried to resurrect his arguments about the center's supposed negative influence. But this time, the judge asked him to provide concrete evidence, not insinuations. He stammered, flipping through his papers without finding anything substantial. Bolstered by the surge of support, presented an even stronger case than before. Sat at the table, every nerve buzzing. This time, though, the environment felt just. Judge Franklin listened respectfully, never once appearing dismissive. Was called to testify again, and she spoke clearly, citing updated data and referencing new endorsements from local schools and businesses. She breathed easier, no longer feeling the oppressive weight of prejudice that had once saturated the courtroom. After listening to both sides, Judge Franklin announced a short recess to review all the evidence. Joined in the hallway, flanked by volunteers from the center who offered heartfelt thanks. Despite the positivity, his nerves twisted, remembering how quickly things had gone wrong the first time. Rested a hand on her shoulder. "Trust the process," she whispered. When they returned, Judge Franklin's ruling was swift but thorough. She dismissed petition to close the center, declaring it an essential public service that had met the necessary legal requirements. Let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Applause erupted from the supporters in the gallery. The judge, maintaining decorum, lifted a hand. "I understand the relief," she said gently, "but let's keep the noise down." Even she wore a small, approving smile, for it was a moment of indescribable vindication. Tears blurred her vision as she turned to embrace. The families in attendance clapped more quietly, tears shining on their own faces. In the swirl of relief she glimpsed, his expression was stormy, a mixture of resentment and begrudging acceptance. Then her eyes drifted to the back of the courtroom, where Hill stood unobtrusively, arms folded. She locked eyes with and gave a slight nod. Returned the gesture, gratitude flooding her. But the story didn't end there. Within days, the Attorney General's office formally charged Judge Mercer with multiple ethics violations and launched proceedings that could lead to his removal from the bench. The sealed documents had received were authenticated, revealing a network of dealings between Mercer and a handful of attorneys, including who had funneled favors in exchange for favorable rulings. The revelations were shocking, yet they also felt like long overdue justice to those who had seen their lives upended by biased decisions. Mercer attempted to fight back, claiming ignorance or that the documents were doctored, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness came forward, each emboldened by the growing possibility that this time, something would actually be done. In the midst of this, found herself thrust into the media spotlight. She agreed to do a few interviews, partly to defend the center's mission, partly because she hoped that people hearing her story might realize how insidious judicial bias could be. She also knew that for every who was able to stand up, there were countless others who never got that chance. After one particularly emotional interview on a local television station, a flood of donation pledges poured into the community center. Within a week, they had more than enough funds to upgrade the building and expand programs. amazed by the outpouring of support, realized that sometimes shining a light on injustice could draw in those who wanted to help, but didn't know how. The day Judge Mercer's disciplinary hearing began, the courthouse was even more packed with reporters and onlookers than during's hearing. Though she wasn't required to attend, decided to be present for at least the first day, wanting to see it through. She arrived early, accompanied by a small group of supporters. The air buzzed with a mix of curiosity, anticipation, and righteous anger. Mercer's attorneys tried to paint him as a misunderstood public servant, contending that the Attorney General's actions were politically motivated. But the panels of evidence told a different story, a story of repeated misuse of power for personal biases and gain. During a recess, stood near the steps outside. She spotted David slipping out a side door, looking pale and avoiding eye contact with anyone. She felt a pang of something close to pity, tempered by the memory of how eagerly he had tried to shut the center down. She didn't chase him or speak to him. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes the strongest statement is simply bearing witness. By late afternoon, she caught a glimpse of Hill standing across the marble foyer, deep in conversation with one of her aides. Feeling a surge of gratitude, walked over. Hill finished her conversation, then turned to greet with a warm smile. "How does it feel to be on this side of things?" she asked, gesturing to the hearing room where Mercer was in the hot seat, let out a breathy laugh. "Strange," she admitted. "I never thought I'd see the day, but I'm relieved, grateful, and I want to thank you again. You didn't have to step in, but you did." The Attorney General's eyes sparkled kindly. "You and your community center deserve justice. That's reason enough. And as for Mercer, I expect this hearing to conclude with appropriate consequences." She paused, tilting her head. "So, what's next for you? I hear the center's thriving." She nodded, a smile blooming. "Yes, we have new funding, more volunteers, and we're starting new programs. Mentorships, job training, you name it. But I also, well, all of this made me realize how much I care about advocacy, how crucial it is to have people fighting for the marginalized. I'm considering going back to school, maybe law school, so I can do more." Hill's smile widened. "That's wonderful. We need more voices like yours. If you ever need guidance or an internship, my office is open to you." She extended a business card. Took it, her hands trembling slightly, feeling the weight of possibility. For so much of her life, doors had been closed or guarded. Now, one of the most powerful women in the state was offering her a key. As the disciplinary hearing continued, it became a landmark case that shone a spotlight on judicial misconduct. Eventually, Mercer was removed from the bench and faced additional legal consequences. David's name also surfaced in the scandal, and though he tried to maintain his practice, his reputation suffered irrevocably. The old guard that had once operated with impunity found itself under scrutiny like never before. Through it all, remained grounded. She spent her mornings in her job as a social worker, her afternoons and weekends at the center, and her evenings studying for the LSAT. There were nights she felt utterly exhausted, questioning if she had the strength to keep pushing against systemic barriers. But then she remembered the kids who came to the center, the parents who found hope in a safe place for their children, and the seniors who gathered for companionship instead of isolation. She remembered how it felt to be nearly thrown out of the courtroom by a judge who saw her only as an inconvenience, and how it felt when the Attorney General walked in and said, "No more." That memory fueled her determination. She was never alone in this battle. At her side were people of principle, community members, and allies with the power to enact real change. She saw that fighting injustice wasn't always a matter of direct confrontation. It could also be about building and uplifting, creating alternative spaces that nourished hope and growth. And in her own small corner of the world, that's exactly what she was doing. Months turned into a year. Renovations at the center were completed, adding new classrooms and upgrading the kitchen for meal services. Joined committees focused on youth mentorship, forging partnerships with local businesses that offered internships and vocational training. She often caught glimpses of herself in the wide-eyed teenagers, some of them uncertain about their place in society, some brimming with raw talent yet lacking direction. She'd share her story, careful not to make it all about her, but highlighting that standing up for what's right could yield surprising allies. On a bright Saturday afternoon, a celebratory open house was held at the newly renovated center. Families poured in, exploring the freshly painted rooms and brand-new recreational spaces. Laughter and conversation reverberated through the halls where, months prior, All anyone had talked about was impending closure. Stood by the entrance, greeting visitors, occasionally offering tour. Her heart soared with pride at the transformation, an undeniable testament to resilience and community spirit. In the midst of greeting people, glanced at the doorway and saw Hill stepping inside, unannounced, accompanied by only one aide. The Attorney General wore a casual blouse and slacks, looking at ease in the lively crowd. A rush of happiness flooded. She made her way through the throng, extending her hand. "I didn't know you'd be coming," said, though her smile made it clear she was delighted. Hill looked around, taking in the freshly painted murals on the walls and the excited children running around. "I had to see it," she said. "The place that almost wasn't, and yet now it thrives. Congratulations." They walked through the corridors, Hill asking questions about the new programs, occasionally stopping to chat with staff. Eventually, they ended up near the back, where the center's new library was being set up with donated books. The sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating shelves that still smelled of fresh wood. Hill rested her hand on one of the shelves and turned to. "You know, in all my years of public service, I've seen many places like this shut down for lack of funds or caught in political crossfire. It's inspiring to see a community refuse to let that happen." His gaze swept over the shelves, the newly stocked desks, the bright posters encouraging reading and exploration. "I almost lost hope," she admitted quietly. "That day in court when I realized how easily everything could be taken away. But then you walked in, and it was like a doorway to possibility opened. I'll never forget that." The Attorney General's eyes glimmered with warmth. "I'm glad I could help, but remember, I only pushed open the door. Everyone here walked through it. That includes you." They exchanged a meaningful look, the weight of those words settling into the air. Knew this was not just about the center or even about Judge Mercer's downfall. It was about the broader truth that justice, while sometimes painfully slow, could be achieved when people refused to remain silent. The moral lesson she had gleaned from this experience was one she hoped to impart to anyone who'd listen. The law might be imperfect, and sometimes those entrusted to uphold it can distort it. But when moral courage stands firm, even entrenched power structures can be challenged and reformed. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden rays across the library, recalled the day everything changed. The scornful face of Judge Mercer, the bailiff stepping forward to remove her, and then Hill, calm yet resolute, interrupting a toxic dynamic that had thrived in the dark for too long. It was as if a single beam of light had illuminated the cracks in the foundation, showing exactly where justice needed reinforcing. Now, standing in the new library, felt something settle deep inside her, an assurance, a quiet resolve. Maybe she would go to law school. Maybe she would devote the rest of her life to protecting spaces like this. Whatever the path, she knew that once your eyes are open to injustice, you can't close them again. And that recognition was both daunting and invigorating. Hill glanced at her watch, signaling that she needed to leave for another engagement. They walked back toward the entrance, weaving through the lively crowd. At the doorway, she paused and extended her hand, too. "You have my number," she said. "Keep me updated, and never doubt that your voice matters." Squeezed her hand firmly. "Thank you for everything." And with that, Hill disappeared into the late afternoon light, leaving with the distinct sense that her journey was only beginning. Outside, children played on a newly built swing set. Parents chatted over refreshments. Volunteers guided new visitors through various rooms, explaining all the programs they could now offer. The center buzzed with life and optimism. Wandered over to a bench beneath a tall oak tree at the edge of the property, taking a moment to just absorb the scene. The subtle rustle of leaves overhead mingled with the laughter of children, the chatter of parents. She thought of the moral she'd gleaned from all this if asked to share it with someone who felt powerless. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of standing up, one refusal to be silenced, to trigger a chain of events that exposes bigger truths. If you act with integrity and speak with courage, you might find allies in places you never imagined. And when that happens, the seemingly unshakable walls of injustice can and do come crashing down. She remembered how the bailiff had been about to escort her out of the courtroom, how humiliation had threatened to swallow her. For a fleeting moment, she had almost resigned herself to the belief that the world was irredeemably unfair. But then, a single figure walked in, a living reminder that not all those in power were corrupt or indifferent. That small hope grew into a wave of change. As she sat on the bench, felt tears prick at her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude and release. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another congratulatory message, perhaps. She decided to let it wait for a minute. She wanted to be fully present in this victory that wasn't just hers, but belonged to every child who would learn in the new classrooms, every struggling parent who would find support, every senior who would pass the afternoon among friends. They had all been spared from losing this place that offered solace and opportunity. Overhead, a cluster of sparrows took flight, their wings flapping with delicate precision. Watched them rise against the sky. It was as though they, too, were celebrating. The wind carried the sound of their departure, a faint flutter that mingled with the bustle around her. In the gentle fading light, she closed her eyes, silently offering thanks to whatever force in the universe had brought the Attorney General to that courtroom in her moment of greatest need. In that final reflection, recognized the deeper truth that would guide her from this day forward. Real justice isn't about punishing the guilty as much as it is about protecting the innocent. Power can be used to oppress or to uplift, and every individual in a position of influence has a choice in how they wield it. The moment Hill stepped into that courtroom, she had made a choice, to use her authority not to maintain the status, but to champion those too often overlooked. Vowed that if she ever rose to a position of influence, she would do exactly the same. With a contented sigh, she opened her eyes, stood from the bench, and walked back toward the center's entrance. The hum of activity inside beckoned her, and she realized that this was where she belonged. In the thick of it, organizing, supporting, striving for a fairer world. It was messy, exhausting, and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also deeply meaningful. And as she had learned, miracles could happen. Even in the dirtiest moments, a sudden turn of events, an attorney general walking into a courthouse, could remind everyone that change is possible. That is the moral heart of story. Stay ready, stay hopeful, and speak your truth. Because sometimes, at just the right moment, someone with the power to transform your reality will walk in,